Hello, I'd like to share a couple thoughts with you about week 6, in which we focused on social capital. To begin with, I just want to point out that much of what you did this week is simply a process of comprehension. In week 3, when we looked at the two essays by Lee Hamilton and Norm Ornstein, we were doing a critical evaluation of two different essays. This week, we were simply reading some fairly dense language, but for the purpose of comprehension. And you might have thought that the readings of Putnam and Skocpol may not have been out of sync with what you read in the textbook, but their writings are quite different from what you find in the textbook, where there's discussion about a variety of different interest groups. But as I hope you put together, the focus of Putnam and Skocpol is in fact old style or mainline interest groups, and why not just interest groups, but in Putnam's view, almost all kinds of social and civic associations are important to the functioning of democracy. So the language that Putnam gives you is, I don't think it's extremely difficult to understand, but it's dense language. So when I ask you to define social capital, what I really want you to do is work on the language that Putnam gives you and peel it apart, take it apart, describe it phrase by phrase, word by word. And Putnam refers to social capital as, he says, social capital refers to features of social organization such as networks, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. So the important thing here is it's not the norms or the networks or social trust or even coordination and collaboration, but rather the features of things associated with all of this. And what I wanted you to do here was to wrestle a little bit with exactly what social capital is, and by asking you for an example, I thought I could force you to think explicitly about what, in fact, a group might look like that is building social capital. That next paragraph after his definition of social capital helps you, I hope, helps you to understand a little bit more what he's talking about. He talks of networks of civic engagement foster sturdy norms of generalized reciprocity. That's a bit wordy, but networks are simply social connections, your connections to different groups and organizations, and fostering sturdy norms just promotes the repeated practice norms of generalized reciprocity. Reciprocity is nothing more than I do a good deed for you and you do one for me. And this process encourages the emergence of social trust. These networks facilitate coordination and communication, they amplify reputations, and thus allow dilemmas of collective action to be resolved. That phrase, dilemmas of collective action, is important because that's largely what democracy is all about. We have to come to collective decisions about problems that we face and arrive at some decision through some process. So this is connected directly to the political system of democracy. He goes on to say that when economic and political negotiation is embedded in dense networks of social interaction, incentives for opportunism are reduced. Incentives for opportunism simply means I'm not going to seek out an advantage for me as an individual. Rather, I'm going to seek outcomes for all of society or all of the organization that I'm associated with. And Putnam goes on to say, at the same time, networks of civic engagement embody past success of collaboration, which can serve as a cultural template for future collaboration. So once you have a history of working at collaboration for mutual benefit, it becomes easier and more natural in the future. And finally, he says dense networks of interaction, and dense networks of interaction is nothing more than an individual's frequent participation in any kind of civic and social organization. And these networks broaden the participant's sense of self, developing the I into we. Again, we're moving from opportunism, or looking out for number one, to collective collaboration for mutual benefit. So, how does this develop within a person? Largely, you can think of it directly from Putnam's language, developing a sense of we instead of I. So it's understanding, once again, the value of collaboration for mutual benefit. And it's really the understanding of that value, which is the mental shift that takes place that moves someone toward understanding why social capital is a good and valuable thing. Social capital makes democracies function better because of that understanding. And in a bowling league or a PTA organization, an individual participates, interacts, collaborates, negotiates, compromises, and is able to take those skills and transfer them into the arena of democracy. So that learning that takes place in a social or civic organization can be applied in a democracy. And in the same way that a person is not behaving opportunistically in the PTA or a community organization, similarly, the person will forego that sense of opportunism when it comes to making political decisions in a democracy. So that's the value that social capital gives toward making democracies function better. I want to talk just briefly about Theda Skocpol's piece, and essentially she's talking about the same thing. She refers to the organizations where social capital is built as the old mainline interest groups, and those are the interest groups where people met face-to-face and worked collaboratively to resolve problems and work out any kind of political outcome for mutual benefit. And the reason I asked you about why, if Skocpol agreed with what the textbook has to say, is because I wanted you to, I hoped that you would realize that she says, well, you could have written this two ways. You could have said that, in fact, Skocpol disagrees with what the text says, and that being that social and economic upheaval result in the growth of interest groups. Well, she would say, yeah, she would agree that, in fact, that does happen, but only the new style of interest groups. The old style of the mainline interest groups declined considerably. So, depending how you worded your essay on this part of the assignment, you could have said, no, she disagrees, because you could say the old line interest groups actually declined in number, or you could have said alternately that yes, she is in agreement because interest groups did grow in number. It was just a new kind of interest group. So that's really all I want to share with you, and I'm hopeful that you have a better understanding what social capital is and why it's important to a democracy.